Howdy everyone, my name's Chris and I have a question for you today. What happens when you take a landscape photographer who lives in West Wales, miles away from pretty much any major sporting event that's ever happened, and plant him in Lee Valley Velo Park in London for a day to test out the fastest sports and events camera Nikon has ever produced? Well, all I know is that I've got a bit of a learning experience ahead of me that also promises to be pretty fun. Let's see if an inexperienced sports photography klutz like me can get to grips with Nikon's new flagship Z9 camera to shoot some of the fastest cyclists in the world in action. This velodrome was completed in time for the London Olympic Games at a cost of £105 million, and it's probably the most incredible and modern velodrome in the world today. Chris Hoy, Victoria Pendleton, Jason Kenny and a number of other British cyclists picked up Olympic gold medals right here, racing down the 56 kilometres of Siberian pine that make up the track. Capturing the speed and detail of the racing that takes place here is a major challenge for even the most skilled photographer, and whatever camera you're using, it had better be the best its manufacturer can offer. Well, the new Nikon Z9 is absolutely the definition of a flagship camera. In fact, one of the reasons I accepted Nikon's invitation to come all the way to London to test it out was because of a lot of its features are a little bit revolutionary, and I wanted to see if it could really live up to the hype, because in one fell swoop, it seems a bit like Nikon have caught up with Canon and Sony's latest EOS R3 and A1 top-of-the-line cameras. Let's have a quick look on the outside first. On the exterior, what immediately jumps out is the camera's very, very large size with embedded vertical grip, handy for portraits, its rock-solid build quality, and also its heavy weight of well over a kilogram. For better or worse, this thing really does feel like a large sports digital SLR camera, except perhaps a little slimmer, and with Nikon's more angular, mirrorless design. Love it or hate it. Unsurprisingly, for a camera in this class, there are plenty of buttons on the body, offering tons of customization, and many of them even light up for nighttime shooting. The camera accepts Nikon's heaviest duty battery, which should last for at least about 750 shots, and for storage it holds up to 2 CF Express Type B cards, although it will also accept the older and slower XQD cards if you have them lying around, but not SD cards. The camera has all kinds of extra features too, like GPS and in-body image stabilization. Now, all of that stuff is very nice and the kind of thing you'd expect from a camera that costs $5.5 grand. The real headlines, though, come in the camera's imaging capabilities and the specs. Well, when you read them, they jump right off the page at you. It has a 45 megapixel sensor with an incredible maximum frame rate of 30 frames per second if you're shooting JPEG and 20 frames per second if you're shooting RAW, which I think brings it nicely in line with Sony's A1 camera, which is admittedly a little higher resolution, just a little, and the Canon EOS R3, which is much lower resolution, only 24 megapixel. If you're shooting in JPEG with a memory card that's fast enough, the camera's buffer will take about 1,000 images at that speed before slowing down, which is almost unimaginable to me. You are going to end up deleting a lot of unwanted pictures with this camera. But also, you'll be capturing the right moment very easily and in great detail. If you really want to push this thing to the limit, then you can even shoot at 120 frames per second if you don't mind capturing 11 megapixel JPEGs. That's how fast this camera can process information. And it's doing all of this thanks to a stacked CMOS image sensor, which feeds images to the camera at an incredibly high speed without any traditional mechanical shutter mechanism at all. What you can see is here is a sensor protector. The images are all taken electronically with this camera. Now, the thought of that kind of spooked me out when I first read about it in a press release. No mechanical shutter, although it's hardly a new idea. I'm used to encountering the typical problems you get when shooting only with an electronic shutter, such as slow flash sync speeds, banding and rolling shutter. There's some of the key issues I'm thinking of here, that the Z9 seems to be blessed with having just about the fastest electronic shutter on the market, and that means a lot of those ugly problems are cut out. It even has a flash sync speed of 1/200th of a second, which is about the level of the best mechanical shutters. Now, I don't want to sound too corny here, I don't want to give away any sound bites, but using a camera like this, which works so well without a shutter mechanism, really feels like you're getting a taste of the future. Mechanical shutters will eventually die off in the same way that digital SLRs are slowly being phased out now, but this is the first camera I've handled where the sensor is fast enough to pretty effectively deal with the associated side effects of an electronic shutter, and we're going to be seeing more and more of that in the future, and I'm definitely not complaining. And it's not just stills photographers who should be excited, because the Z9 has the makings of a blisteringly powerful video camera too, managing to be the first Nikon camera to shoot in 8K 10-bit footage internally, even potentially in my favourite Apple ProRes format, and with a firmware update up to 60 frames per second. Over the past year or so, shooting with my Canon EOS R5, I've actually found 8K video work to be immensely useful in certain situations. Well, specs are one thing, but ultimately you have to experience this camera to really get a grip with how well it works. The autofocus system is probably what Nikon are proudest about here. It uses excellent face and eye detection in conjunction with their old 3D tracking system in order to get autofocus that really sticks to your subject quite stubbornly, even against the challenge of shooting indoor sports. On the whole, even an inexperienced sports shooter like me was able to get plenty of keeper shots. If you demand complete and utter perfection from your autofocus system, then, well, you need to have more realistic expectations, because even the best cameras will slightly miss occasionally, but as you can see here, a real advantage of shooting at 30 frames per second is that your chances of getting a shot where the focus is nailed down also increases. I was particularly impressed with the colours that this camera's images yield. I was shooting in auto white balance the whole time, but the camera coped very well, and I found myself doing very little tweaking and editing. If anything, the colours are very slightly warm, but not in a disturbing way. High ISO noise performance is just average for a camera in this class. The camera's JPEG engine generates plenty of fine detail here, perhaps a little bit more than my Canon EOS R5, but the image does look just a little bit noisier than I'm used to. And for those of you who might be wondering if you really need a 45 megapixel camera for sports, well, most of the time you don't really, but sometimes that ability to crop in for some close detail will make a lot of difference. When it comes to the Z9, well, there's not very much not to like about the camera, especially considering that this thing only costs $5,500. Okay, for someone like me that's a huge amount of money, but for a camera so fully spec'd for the future, it's a bit of a bargain really. No doubt Nikon saved a lot of money by removing that traditional shutter mechanism, but the size and weight is something to really consider, especially if you're like me and you're a bit more into climbing up and down mountains with your camera and doing landscape work than sports photography. It's also a fair bit heavier than the competition. The electronic shutter is incredibly fast, but not quite fast enough to avoid seeing some flickering on display panels in your backgrounds, so banding still is a bit of an issue. You can see this in other reviews on the internet. Also, SD cards. Being able to use SD cards might have been really nice. Serious sports photographers might laugh at me for even mentioning them in this video, but the fact remains that they are ubiquitous and affordable, and it's useful to be able to shoot on them in an emergency. Overall though, the Z9 is unsurprisingly an absolute killer camera, a big step forward for Nikon in their mirrorless game. It's a bit too bulky for me to start carrying it up and down Welsh mountainsides for casual landscape photography shots, but then again, that's just not what it's intended for. And sport, wedding and event photographers will have a blast with its speed, power and professional digital SLR feel.